1959, Galway races. Our house was packed with holidaymakers and racegoers headed for the afternoon's horse racing at Ballybrit, about 3 miles outside town. The only rooms not occupied were my parents', my great-aunt Bridget's, and my grandfather's. I was sleeping on a couch in the living room next to the kitchen, my brother John next door at our Uncle Bill's, and Liam, the youngest, down the street at his friend Sean Cahill's. "Where are we going to put Birdie?" my mother said. "We'll have to put her in Bridgie's room," my father said, referring to his 80-something-year-old aunt, Bridget Fearick, an old maid who lived upstairs. My mother put the pan she'd been scrubbing on the draining board and looked at my father. "You don't mean—" "I do. She won't like that, and you'll have to be the one to tell her, because I'm not." While my father was upstairs talking to Bridgie, my mother said to me, "Birdie is only staying a few days, and I can't see herself and Bridgie fitting in the one bed, and Birdie with such a big bottom." Birdie and my mother had grown up together at the Weir, the fishing village at the east end of Galway Bay, where my grandfather had farmed, raised cattle, and owned oyster beds before he sold everything and came to live with us. She was a dressmaker, a second cousin of my mother's, and managed to scrape out a living doing alterations, sewing and trimming and mending already made women's clothes. Unmarried, Birdie rented a small cottage at the end of Athenry village, 20 miles from Galway, and had just called from a phone box on the street, saying that she was catching the Dublin to Galway train that stopped in Athenry and would see us shortly. Don't worry," I said to my mother. "Herself and Bridgie will probably get along fine." Bridgie's room was at the west gable of our house. One window looked out on St. Mary's Field, and the other our backyard. There was a crucifix on the wall, a statue of the Sacred Heart on the mantelpiece, a framed photograph of Pope Pius XII above her bed, a rocking chair by the fireplace, and several mousetraps lying on the floor. She kept to herself and never ate meals with us. I had to be careful when I brought food up to her on a tray from the kitchen and not step on a mousetrap. She might be sitting in the rocker, lying in bed reading her prayer book, or prodding the fire with a poker when I'd enter. Bridgie was a small woman with a heavily wrinkled face, dark, angry eyes, straight black hair, dyed, and always wore plain grey or black clothing, a woolen shawl sometimes wrapped round her shoulders. Later that morning, I bought the Irish Press at Cahill's grocery down on the corner and brought it up to my grandfather's room. He sat in a chair by the window, and after he spent a few minutes looking at the racing page, he turned to me and said, "I fancy Highfield lad in the plate. Johnny Lehane's over from England to ride. Will you put a half-a-crown each way on it for me?" He was shrewd at picking horses, and after he handed me the 5 shillings, I told him that Birdie was due to arrive at any moment and that she and Bridgie would be sharing a bed. He threw back his head and laughed. "Oh," he said, "there'll be a ree-raw agus rúlia-búlia in this house tonight." Birdie arrived just before 11. I was mowing our lawn and saw her coming up the front steps. Soon as she spotted me, Birdie dropped her bag on the top step and headed towards me across the grass. A big, jolly-looking woman with a roly-poly figure and apple-blossom cheeks. She was wearing a long, loose-fitting frock that swayed and shifted with the movement of her expansive hips. "How are you, Machine?" She embraced me, her eyes full of warmth and mischief. "I thought you'd be out in the cat's farting cabin, looking after those poor creatures." Birdie and my mother were mad about cats. My whole family was, barring Bridgie, who mistreated them if she got the chance. My father preferred dogs. Every stray cat that came by we fed leftovers to in a shed out back, or as Bertie called it, the cat's farting cabin.